What's going on? Welcome back. Today we will be talking about anatomy of SQL injection attack from a security perspective or for the purpose of securing your own databases. Now, first we have to understand the phases, the tools used, the methods in order to secure systems properly. The first thing is the client side and the server side. So we have two sides in the game. The client side, which is you, the user, or the tester, and the server side, mostly it is the database. So most of the time, the SQL injection happens in two places. The first one is the search field or the login forms. So most probably we'll be testing either a search field or a login form in order to identify if the backend database is vulnerable to SQL injection. Now, most of the time, login form, when you log in, a SQL query is executed in the users table to look for the user. If the user exists, and the password is correct, it will grant you access. If it doesn't exist, then you will be denied access. So technically, that's how it works for the login forms. Now, the search field, when you search for something, the database will look through a specific table. Let's say you're looking for something in the post page. So the database will take your search query and look in the table posts, for example, and it will return results based on your query. Of course, every table consists of rows and columns. So that's the first aspect. Two, we have to find out if the backend database is vulnerable, we have to break the database logic. How to break the logic? We have to cause an error. Okay, so we have to break the logic of the database so that the database will think that we are doing something wrong, or the query is wrong, or the data doesn't exist whatsoever. So we have to cause an error, break the logic. Now, most of the time, if the error is returned, or if you can see the error on the screen, then database is vulnerable to SQLi vulnerability or SQL injection. If the error, or if you cause an error but you cannot see it, okay, it means that you have to first know from the changes on the page. Now, if you see changes between query to query, it means that database is vulnerable to blind SQL injection, which is harder to detect since there is no feedback from the database. There is no error returned to the client. Most of the time, we know that the database is vulnerable by monitoring the response of the database. If there is an error, we conclude that, yeah, there is a vulnerability. But if there is no response, which is the case for most of the real-world web applications, you will not see an error returned back to the screen unless the database is extremely vulnerable. So mostly you will encounter blind SQL injection when you conduct web application penetration testing for SQL injection. You will not see errors returned back. You have to try many queries and monitor the changes on the page in order to conclude if there is a blind SQL injection vulnerability. Once you have determined if there is a vulnerability, you go to step 3. The step 3 is we determine the number of columns. Now, determining the number of columns is done by the order by. So you use order by. We will demonstrate that in a bit, but order by is used to determine the number of columns. You keep trying using the order by statement unless you hit an error. Once you hit an error on the page, you will know that the number of columns is equal to the last number you have tried in the order by statement. So those who tried order by will understand what I mean. 4, after identifying the number of columns, then we head to executing the queries and retrieve the information. So while we conduct a SQL injection attack, or while we test for a SQL injection attack, we mostly aim for gaining insights on database name, the tables, the columns, and finally, we try to extract the hashes. 4, what is the difference between manual and automatic SQL injection? So technically, the manual and the auto differs only by one aspect, which is using the tool. If you're using the tool, then you're using auto SQL injection attack. If you're not using a tool, then you're doing manual SQL injection testing. So the manual is time consuming. So you will have to, if you are doing SQL injection in a real case or for your clients, you're trying to find out if they are vulnerable to SQL injection, you have to, and you're doing the manual method, you have to try many SQL payloads in order to identify if the backend database is vulnerable or not. So especially if the application is secure. So we will be spending more time identifying if there is an actual vulnerability or not. It requires extensive SQL knowledge. So one condition to perform penetration testing for SQL injection vulnerability using the manual method is having an extensive knowledge in the SQL query language. Without extensive knowledge, without understanding the basics such as the select, from, where, union, join, less, limit, order by, without understanding these queries used in SQL, you will be having a hard time conducting manual SQL injection. Deep scan. So if you have extensive knowledge and you have the time to perform extensive SQL injection scan, the results will mostly be comprehensive. After you finish your scan and after you finish your testing, most of the time your testing is comprehensive and your results are 90% correct, because as I said earlier, manual SQL injection is more extensive, is more thorough than the auto method. But you can use the manual method if you have only one client who you want to perform a penetration test. If you have many clients, it's not recommended to use the manual method unless the auto method fails. Now, the automatic method, of course, less time, you're using tools. Available tools, we have many tools to perform SQL injection testing, such as SQLMap, Burp Suite, OWASP. Less deep than the manual method, which means that the results may not reflect the actual reality. For example, if the SQLMap output was indicating that the server or the database is not vulnerable, well, it may not be vulnerable against a number of payloads or the payloads that SQLMap actually uses. But if there are other payloads, or if there are application firewalls, or if there are filters, then the output by SQLMap or any of these tools may not reflect the correct picture. So if you find out that the backend database is not vulnerable, and you have been informed by your client that the database is vulnerable, or if there is some wrong in the database, then you have to resort to the manual method. So if you have many clients, if you have many targets, use the auto method. If the auto fails, and you know that it fails, okay, use the manual method. Now it's a scalable. Scalable means that you can perform the testing on many clients at a time. While the manual method, you have to be focused on one client at a time in order to perform the penetration test correctly. Okay, so next we will be using an example from TryHackMe to demonstrate the SQL injection in a simple manner. So the example is TryHackMe Advent of Cyber 2, day 5. This is the practical scenario to demonstrate the theory behind, or the theory of the SQL injection. Now, as you can see, we have a SQL form, login form. Now, as I said earlier, we have to break the logic of the SQL. Now, let me grab a payload, SQL payload, to demonstrate this. So let's take this one. So the code here, we have the code, and we have or 1 = 1, and then we have dash dash and we have this. So basically, this one is to break the logic. So with the code, we break the logic of the SQL query. Why? If you don't know why, it means that you don't know SQL. So get back to SQL and learn the basics of SQL to understand why the code breaks the logic. If you are just here to learn how to bypass login forms or conduct SQL injection without basic knowledge, then this is not for you. Okay, or 1 equal 1 is a way to reconstruct or tell the database that this statement is true all the time. And here we comment out the rest of the query. So most of the time you have either the username field or the password field for vulnerable. If the username field is vulnerable, you put the SQL payload in the username field. If the password field is vulnerable, you put the SQL field in the password field. So here we have, for example, the username field is vulnerable. Now the comment here will comment out the rest of the SQL query, so you don't need to enter the password. So if you now enter with this payload and log in, see, without password, as you can see, we have been able to log in. Why? Because we used the comment character. So now we are in the search field, and search field is one playground for SQL injection testing. Now, when we are in a search field, okay, we have to first find out the number of columns. So we have multiple payloads or multiple ways to find out this. So I'm going to use the order by. Let me use this one. So as I said earlier, first we break the logic, okay, and construct the query, and then we comment out the rest. So order by 1, we start with 1. Okay, now as you can see, we have results returned. Now I want to find out the number of columns. We have to continue using the order by until we hit an error. So since there is no error on the screen, that means that 1 is not the actual number of columns. There are more. So 2, still we have 3, now we hit an error. First order by term out of range. So out of range, it means that we have exceeded the number of available columns, which means that the number of columns is the last number we have used with the order by, or the before we hit the error, which is 2, not 3. So we have 2 columns now. If we get back to 2, which is actually correct, we have only 2 columns, gift and child. If we get back to 1, okay. Now, after I've determined the number of columns, we can start using SQL payloads with union select. Okay, our aim is to retrieve information as such as the database version, the hashes, the users, the passwords. That's our aim when we conduct SQL injection. So after I've determined the number of columns, we head to using union select. So basically, we can break the query of the SQL and union select, let's say user name password from users. As you can see, we have returned the usernames and their passwords. Of course, the current example we have is not 100% secure, and I'm sure it is vulnerable. So that's why everything is working. Now, the second way is using SQLMap. So let me log out and open the browser one more time. Okay, so now, if you don't want to use the manual method, you can just use the automatic method. Use Burp Suite in conjunction with SQLMap. So intercept is on. Okay, forward Okay, so here we turn the intercept and login. Okay. Let's put some demo info, admin password. Okay, so we take the request, save it as, put here perp request.txt. All right, so we have the requests here. We fire up SQLMap. So SQLMap. Now sudo SQLMap -r perp request. Okay, so beforehand, we have been informed that the web application here is using a firewall. So in order to instruct SQLMap to bypass or to try to bypass the firewall, we use --tamper equal space to comment. Okay, so what do we do next? Next, we first identify the database version or the name of the database. So for that, we will use the switch --current-db --current-db, and don't forget to use batch if you don't want SQLMap to ask you about every stage during the attack. So based on the results, as you can see, the output displaying the backend DBMS is SQLite. So we have determined the backend database. And there are additional information to our query here. So as you can see, the results indicating that the parameter username in the post request is vulnerable to time-based blind SQL injection. So after we have retrieved the database, we have to enumerate the columns, the tables, and then we skip right to the table that we would like to have information from. So database, we list the tables with --tables. So after determining the database type, we type -t SQLite, and then we start enumerating other aspects such as the tables, the columns, and of course we end up with the hashes. So if you want to enumerate the tables, we type --tables. If you want to enumerate specific table, what you would do is you would specify the table name. For example, -t, table name is users. If you want to specify a specific column inside the table, you would type the table name and then -c, the column name. For example, -t users, the column name is password. And you would keep going like this. All right, let's get back now to the questions. So the questions are first, without using directory brute forcing, what is Santa Secrets login panel? There is a hint here how to find that. So it is Santa panel, which is out of the scope of my tutorial, but this is the answer. How many entries are there in the gift database? If you get back to the results here, you'll see we have 22 entry. All right, so what did Paul ask for? If you get back and look through the table, you will see that Paul asked for GitHub ownership. Okay, what is the flag? Now the flag, you can find the flag by running SQLMap, as I demonstrated earlier, and dumping all of the entries in the users table. What is admin password? You don't need SQLMap for this. You can just go back and type union select username password from users. So you see the admin password is this one. So that was about today. See you in the next video.